Okay, we're good. So buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining the Comadre Network this afternoon. This is our first kickoff, our first conversation in some time. So we are truly humbled and honored to have this plática with Anthony Chavez, especially this week, especially given the fact that we are really in the midst of honoring our resilience in our history and our heroes and our icons. And so welcome, Anthony. Thank you for joining us in the Comadre Network, as I mentioned, to be able to engage with you this evening. And so welcome. We are honored to have you here. Did you want to say a few words before I get into my script?
Sure. Yeah. No. Well, thank you very much to Dr. Rivas for joining me in this dialogue, and also, of course, to everyone behind the scenes at La Comadre Network. Really happy to be here with you all and to be wrapping up my day today in this a little bit more comfortable and relaxed setting. I was laughing and I think about it from time to time, how I just grew up with a lot of really strong and powerful and intelligent women figures in my life. My mother, my grandmother, my tias, and all my primas and everything. And it was funny because when I started doing some of my nonprofit and advocacy work, I ended up in a lot of spaces that were heavily kind of like almost female dominated, you might say, in contrast to the other spaces that we sometimes hear about or work in. And it was really funny. I just like immediately felt comfortable. So I have that same feeling of comfort knowing that this is part of a La Comadres network. I know it's probably, and I hope it's not only just women joining us today, strong mujeres, but I hope there's also some, really awesome men too in the circle as well and others. So thank you for organizing this. I'm just really honored to be here now that it's been over 20 years since the creation of the holiday of the Day of Recognition, the Day of Service and Learning, in honor of my grandfather, Cesar Chavez. I think a lot of people connect to the movement through these simple phrases and slogans of "Si se puede" and "Yes, we can." And I think it's really awesome because some of these folks never have been near the fields of California, have never met a farm worker, and yet we hear about and we see these slogans being used by our first African-American president. We hear about it being used in cartoons like Dora the Explorer and Bob the Builder, and being featured in different Disney movies for adolescents and high school age students. And so it always just makes me really proud to see how the spirit of Si se puede and the attitude of yes, we can continues to live on and inspire more generations. Again, as we think about this day of recognition, when they were making the plans for the Cesar Chavez holiday, they kind of asked like, well, what would the family think is important? And at the time, my parents and aunts and uncles said, well, I think we really want it to be a day on. We don't want it to be another day off in honor of somebody that we don't take the time to really learn about and think about how we can go out and live in the spirit of their example that we're all upholding. So I always think about this time as an opportunity to commemorate as well as to celebrate, but most importantly, to rededicate ourselves to the principles and the virtues of the farm workers movement. So with all of that being said, I'm just happy to be here to share a little bit of the stories about the lessons that we learned, sometimes marching and protesting and picketing on the weekends when we weren't playing Little League or doing soccer or hiking in the hills that we were very fortunate to grow up in. It's just a really nice time of year. Usually we're lucky and we're able to actually try to build bridges and identify the common humanity by linking Martin Luther King Jr. Day in January to Cesar Chavez Day and going around and kind of making that a season of service and a period of peace. And talking about these two figures, but also more importantly, the movements that they represented. It's kind of unfortunate that American history is usually rendered in this very basic manner of one person, one place, and one date. And so it's fun when we get a chance to share and to talk about the movement, what made them similar, what made them different, what made them great in their own right, and what can we learn from that and carry on again in that spirit. So thank you very much for having me here, and I'm looking forward to talking with you a little bit more, getting to know each other in the process.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I think part of we had a conversation prior to obviously coming to this moment, and I shared with you that the excitement when I shared with my daughters that I would be interviewing Anthony Chavez, the grandson of Cesar Chavez, and the excitement that they had just to, one, say we know the family, we know their family, we know that their movement, the legacy continues, and really the one of the questions my oldest asked was, what about the rest of the family? Like, what about the mom? What about the grandma? What about like you mentioned, like being raised by prominent, strong female figures? But the point I was making here is that point you just made about history being taught and what is not being taught, or the simplicity in which is being taught. And I think that's why we have this opportunity to create our platforms, to dig a little deeper, to really talk about the commonalities with other communities, talk about the reason why we often don't hear, richness of the history that your grandfather was also advocating for in terms of not only the farm workers and their needs, but so much more that he was really instilling in us as a community in terms of to be awakened, to be united, to be nonviolent. And so I shared with you, what are some of those stories that you would want us to remember and learn that we wouldn't know otherwise about your grandfather today, this week? And I think I ask that because some of us are sorting through a lot of questions of what else did we not know? What else is the history books not telling us? Because there's still a lot of room for improvement in terms of the stories that we want to be able to share with our folks. And so I'm just wondering, like, what are some of those lessons that that you carry that you would want to share with us?
Yeah, well, just makes me think about so much. I kind of immediately thought about, I think, that slogan that they use a lot in ethnic study circles about no history, no self. And no history, there's no self. And so I really think about our own families and the many personal stories that we all have. And, if we're lucky and we're fortunate enough to understand our own family genealogy and ancestry, usually there's a lot of really awesome and powerful stories about our forefathers that I think we should all be inspired by. When I think about not only my father's family, the Chavez family, but I also think about my mother's family, the Perez Chicas. I think there's a lot of rich history on both of those sides of my family that make me equally inspired. Starting, with the Chavez family coming from Mexico, being involved in the revolution down there with Pancho Villa, my great grandmother, coming from the Copper Canyon, being a curandera of the Raramuri and the Tarahumara tradition, them living in America sometimes for even a longer period than some of my white friends that I grew up who emigrated after my own family had already been making a mark in the Old West, being present to events like the OK Corral and being around in the old Wild West days, some of them even driving Wells Fargo stagecoach wagons, to the experience that my grandfather and them faced growing up on a family farm outside of Yuma, Arizona, losing that and joining so many others during the great hardship of the Great Depression that came out to California, even those who were written about by John Steinbeck in his books, such as The Grapes of Wrath, and in other stories that he wrote, where we actually think that there was a great uncle that one of the stories that he wrote about, one of the great, I believe it was cotton strikes of the Central Valley near Pixley, we actually think that some of that history is also based on a great uncle of ours, in some ways maybe a predecessor to my grandfather, Cesar Chavez. So I'm sure he inspired him, and I know he actually went and spent time to learn from him. On my mother's side, the Perez Chicas, just first of all, that name is very unique. So there's not a lot of us out there. Well, there are, but in the sense there's not. And so it's really cool to know that history and to have been fortunate enough to have gone and visited the town of Calvillo, Aguascalientes, where they're from in Mexico, and to understand that story about making it across the border, going through places like Mexicali and whatnot, and eventually arriving into the small town of McFarland, and how they've been there and they've been able to establish those roots and in their own small way do their best to live out and fulfill what the American dream looks like to them and to their families. And I think on both sides of my family, I'm really lucky to know that history, to know myself and where I come from, and it makes me very proud, and it really allows me to hold my head upright and to stand tall and to do my best to move and act and be in the world in a way that I think honors all of that rich and proud cultural history that we all bring and come from.
Absolutely. I think it's the richness that you just named, to be able to transgress generations. I think that's the important and the beauty of hearing folks like yourself share that with us, because that's the level of detail and information and connection to through generations that we want to make sure that our children in our communities have access to, right? Because you mentioned the forefathers, and to me, it's like it's beyond that narrative. It's beyond that, as we know it, the hegemonic discourse in terms of what stories are being told. And so even in this 2-minute that you just shared the legacy of your own family, is like, wouldn't that be that much powerful if our children access not only the Chavez history, but the community history in the textbooks? And I know, especially because I know your work is also in your professional work is also in educational advocacy. And so I want to be able to highlight, the getting to know Anthony, like what is the work that Anthony is doing, is clearly having, your grandfather, Cesar Chavez, be an icon in our community. It's also to speak about what lessons have you gained from him to really shape the lens that you bring to your own work, in your advocacy work, your educational advocacy, and also your political work. So if you can share a little bit of your own professional advocacy work for us.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking. Well, I kind of want to just like step back and talk about how I come to where I find myself presently and where I aspire to go. Growing up in the midst of the social justice movement that my grandfather was at the helm of, that my parents and so many others in my family, again, on both sides of my family, the Perez Chica side and the Chavez side as well, that were involved in the farm workers movement. I just was really proud, even though I didn't maybe have a full grasp of the history that they were making. And it really wasn't until, I would say, probably my grandfather passed away when I was in like the 3rd grade, that my world began to really start to change. We were taken out of school and were picked up as a family, and my uncle's trying to get us all together so that they could break the news to us. And as he's trying to play the radio in that awkward moment of silence where everybody's trying to figure out what's going on, immediately there's like a news flash and they're about to say something about, the great Cesar Chavez, and he has to turn off the radio so that, we have a chance to hear what was happening at that point with our family and process that together. And then going to Delano and seeing that small town of Delano almost double overnight in the funeral and the mass and all of the celebration, commemoration that took place at that time. To then going back to school and seeing my school community gather around to plant a tree in honor of my grandfather. And so then I started to ask, like, well, that's kind of strange, because like I knew they were doing really important stuff, and this is really incredible, just hard to really fathom. And now I'm at school and I'm like, but I know like some of my other friends, their grandparents have passed away, and I don't like, which one of these trees is named after them? And then all of a sudden being invited to go to like parks and library namings and things of that sort, you start to wonder and step back. And I think the way that I asked the question a couple years later after my grandfather passed, and I was probably about 10 years old, I think the question I asked to myself is, even if your last name wasn't Chavez, would you want to be a part of something like the farm workers movement? And the answer was always a resounding yes. But growing up, I realized, having other cousins and family members who lived much closer to the fields than I did, who worked in the fields during the summertime to help pay for the things that they wanted, that they wanted. I started to also just realize that maybe the farm workers issue wasn't the issue I was most closely identified with. Even though that's I would say deep in my heart, and I carry the plight of the farm workers movement with me to this day, I started to think about where are other places, where could I find my own causa? And so after many years of going around and sharing in public schools, I've actually been sharing in schools more than half of my life. The first place I shared at was actually Cal State Fresno when I was a junior in high school. And that was when I was 16. I'm about to be 36 this year. I just started to see the possibilities of what a high quality education could do and could mean for others and for myself. And so after many years of sharing in schools, working out on political campaigns, working in political advocacy and lobbying, if you will, I started to think about what topic or what area would I want to be most involved in. And I thought back to all of the work that I did sharing in those schools, sitting and meeting with teachers in the break room, talking with administrators, and engaging directly with young people, playing Foursquare and hanging out in recess and visiting their classes and having lunch with them, that hopefully I could spend my energy trying to make schools as good as some of the schools that I saw that were out there. The ones that were really breaking the odds, serving those students who were students who looked like me, who didn't come with all the resources that we'd want to give our children, but yet were able to excel and exceed what was expected of them. And so, yeah, I've been very fortunate for the last couple of years to really have been deeply engaged in doing a lot of educational equity advocacy, primarily with my good friends at the Education Trust West, but with a whole host of partners, including La Comadre Network, who joined us on so many different issues when I was there working with them for the last 5 years.
Yeah. It's beautiful. I mean, thank you for, I think, that question in terms of, is this like the legacy or movement that I can see myself carrying forward, and how you're able to just tease that out further and saying, I'm going to be able to essentially carry the spirit that my grandfather and families combined push forward in this realm, which is educational advocacy. I think it's beautiful because I think, reflecting as to having this opportunity of engaging with you, and then how do we honor your grandfather? I think because, on a personal level, because he is an iconic figure for our communities, period, but especially folks that look like us, look like you, look like your grandfather. I shared with you yesterday, oftentimes I look to figures that look like me so I can connect and say, what can I emulate? Because they are the folks that we gravitate to. And so it's sort of asking myself that same question of, what is that legacy that I can carry forward, and how does it look like for us? And I think that's ultimately the question that we all remind ourselves, especially this week, when we honor your grandfather, is how can we continue this work? How can we make sure that he sacrificed and had led, and as I mentioned, he used his body as a shield to protect our communities. And so I think that's one of the questions, teasing it even further, especially right now, that is, 2020 really hit us hard, but it's to reflect, how do we carry that spirit? How do you hone into that spirit? And that's a question that we've asked ourselves as La Comadre Network, is how do we hone into that resilience to keep moving forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that you were talking about how do we carry on. When I think about the legacy of the farm workers movement and carrying on those traditions, I actually was very fortunate that when I was in college, I got really excited about philosophy and religious studies, and I actually ended up completing my degree in philosophy and religious studies, even though I basically could have double majored, I guess, in political science. But after working a little bit and dabbling in politics, I felt like politics wasn't exactly a science, it was more of an art. And so I felt more comfortable emphasizing and trying to do maybe some deeper thinking in the philosophy and religious studies department. And while I was looking at a lot of different religious and philosophical traditions and looking at what united them and looking especially at the practitioners of those traditions who were most socially engaged, one of the things that I came upon was socially engaged Buddhism and learning more about Buddhism. We're learning about, I believe, it's Theravadan Buddhism, one of the more traditional forms out of Thailand. And one of the things that they talked about, I think in the Sanskrit word, is that tradition means a passing on. And it's not really like a clinging to, because whenever we try to cling to something, we're going to kind of like, it's going to still escape our grasp and slip in between our fingers, or we're going to suffocate it and smother it. And it's really that carrying on and that passing forward. So what are the best parts I could take of the past and try to carry forward with me today and do it in my own way? I think what's really important is to start with what makes you come most fully alive. I think it was the late great Howard Fuller who's talked about what the world needs is people who've come alive, and you should really find what makes you come alive. So start with finding where your passion is, but then also thinking about where you can also use the best of your abilities and skills to maybe meet the need, and that's where that sweet spot might be. And I think for me, as I thought about my own life and looking back, I saw I was really only a student who had spent a lot of time in school settings and a traditional, but also in a very unique manner as a guest presenter and speaker and a proponent of service learning, youth participatory action research, and character education. I also thought, well, how can I also maybe work to better serve, our public schooling systems and create better opportunities for our students. And I think that's how I eventually found myself looking for a role to affect greater kind of state level wide policy in K-12 systems and higher ed systems. And so I was fortunate that I did ultimately find that opportunity to do that with the Education Trust West, and continued, staying in touch with my good friends and colleagues over there and support them from a distance, even though I'm now kind of moving on and I'm looking for some newer opportunities to develop and to grow myself, but to also contribute and give more back.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I know that that's how we met, when you were doing some advocacy work out in the Inland Empire and San Bernardino region in terms of really, organizing folk. And that's ultimately, I think that's how I saw you as well. That before I realized that you were Chavez's grandson, but just the work and the word and the energy that you put forth is really to making sure that folks are organized and that they understand policy and they understand the ripple effect that ultimately will impact our communities. And so on that front, I want to just again take the time to thank you for that work, especially when we are talking about targeting rural areas or agriculture areas that we continue to be overlooked and we are marginalized. And so again, I just want to thank you. Not that I'm the spokesperson of our region, but certainly focused. It continues that to me is that legacy of your grandfather's legacy, which is our rural communities are marginalized, period. And then the level of needs have heightened over time. But your work through Ed Trust and other efforts have really elevated a conversation to be able to say we need to be able to hold folks accountable.
Well, yeah, no, thank you. And thanks to so many others. I was just with the Colegas network, a whole network of Latino professionals that serve our community college systems here in California. And it was just a tremendous conversation listening to the folks who are there leading their institutions, pushing them to evolve and better serve their students. So I have to really say thank you to you and to so many others who are out there doing that work up and down and around the state, but in particular, those of my friends who are in the fishhook of California, through the Great Central Valley and out into the Inland Empire in particular. I always really think about those communities as much as possible and try to make sure that they're invited into these larger statewide conversations, because I think unfortunately they get overlooked, overshadowed by the bigger metro areas, with the bigger school districts and the bigger headlines and what have you.
Absolutely. So again, thank you for that focus. I think I want to come back to, and there's many, like you shared in your introductory comments about, some quotes, slogans, and some of these really important words that your grandfather left us with. And I want to share one that's one of my favorites and see how it connects to our reflection on the day-to-day basis today in terms of everything we're going through with the pandemic, with Black Lives Matter. And so we'll start diving into a little bit more about, again, some of that reminder of how to stay grounded and some of the work that we still have ahead of ourselves. So one of my favorite quotes here is, once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. You cannot uneducate a person who has learned to read. You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride. You cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore. We have seen the future, and the future is ours. And so that's, again, one that I always go back to, and I go back to, and I go back to, because of him teaching us, right? That once that consciousness, that awareness, the connection to community, and realization that we have the power, because that's ultimately, like he kept reminding us, the power is among the people, the comunidad. That's, I think, when we honor your grandfather and we honor the work and the legacy that he continues to instill in us. It's that quote. And so I'm wondering, what is that? That quote, it speaks to you, and or are there any quotes that you always gravitate to?
Yeah, well, actually, that one was on my list of things that I wanted to include in my opening remarks, but somehow didn't get to, but I figured would come up. So I have that quote and a few others that I like to always keep at the top of my list. And I'm also just really pleased that you actually read the entirety of that quote, and you read that last important line about we have seen the future and the future is ours. I think, when my grandfather said that, he didn't think that he was going to see his full fruition of his dream, just like Martin Luther King Jr. knew that he wouldn't see that beloved community. But I think it's an important reminder, like you said, that together we're stronger, together we'll go farther, together we can build the world of our dreams. And I think what's also important about that too is that we have to remember that my grandfather, Dolores, the Filipino Manongs, all of those great leaders of the farm workers movement, they went through so many trials and tribulations, so many ups and downs, victories and losses, and sadly, probably more losses than victories. And I say that to mean that my grandfather wasn't naive, thinking that social change was inevitable. He knew that power concedes nothing without a demand. And so he knew that you had to be strategic, and you had to be organized, and you had to work really, really, really hard and put in that time. And so, I also think about the beginnings of his own work as a young community organizer, taking on issues of police brutality in Eastside San Jose, working to do voter registration drives in Los Angeles and around the state with the community service organization. And we see how those issues still continue to plague us today. And so again, he wasn't naive. And I think that's why later on he would tell people, we don't need perfect political systems. What we need is a more perfect participation, really to bring the full voice of the community forward. And so I think that's also another important thing to remember. It's really about making sure everybody's showing up and fully engaged and involved. And so that's one of the things that I really appreciated over the years, working with so many different partners and organizations who really tried to be about that critical understanding of how society operates, but also doing the best and doing to the best of our abilities to really center those who are most impacted by the issues, and uplift those voices in an equitable manner. Because my grandfather also wanted to build a movement by and for farm workers. He didn't need to have, experts come in and tell them how to do everything. They certainly were happy to people helping them out, but they weren't looking for any saviors. He kind of knew, like that old Dutch proverb, the best place to look for a helping hand was at the end of your arm.
Mm.
And so, yeah, it kind of makes me think about all of those things. But yeah, there's just so much in there, especially around just having that pride and not being afraid. I think that's just so important to begin to shed that fear.
Absolutely. And I think part of why I bring the quote in, especially because in light of we're experiencing a pandemic, which, the virtual reality that we're in, it's, I won't go off on a political agenda or script on that. But the point is that it's really reminding us, because we are away, because we're not connected physically, this power that we still have as community to be able to speak to these issues, to be able to speak to the awareness. And you said, for us to understand how the systems work. And I see, personally, I still think there's still a lot of room of really speaking to how systems actually do work. But I think at the end of the day, like you said, we're at a point where we're not waiting for saviors. It's really us as community members to be able to say, we're going to do this ourselves, and going and honoring the quote that I read, the future is ours. But I think it's also important for us to reckon the reality, as he's mentioned, not only your grandfather, but everyone around him during his, era and prior to him, is this notion that all the work that we're doing is really to not only honor the 7 generations that came before us, but the 7 generations that come after us. And so we ourselves may not necessarily see the fruits of our labor, but we'll make sure to remind folks where we're coming from. And so I think that's really the way I want to be consistently honoring the work that your grandfather led, because it was farm worker led, it was community led, it was, we have the power and the voice to organize. But then at the same time, bridging that connection to, now let's tackle on the system. Now let's really talk about inequities. Now let's really talk about, some of the work that you've done. And so I want us to also talk about your work really pushing like Prop 16. Let's really talk about there's so many of us now really willing to take on this physical, like systematic fight. And so I want us to talk a little bit about your work pushing Prop 16 and what it means for us to now really hold systems accountable.
Yeah, no, that's yeah, well, thank you for the invitation to do that. I was very, very proud to be a part of the team at EdTrust West, as well as a whole cadre of other really, really strong partners who helped to get what eventually became Prop 16 through the legislature, and then eventually onto an election ballot, with, I think, only about 9 months until the election. So it was a whirlwind. I think it was actually less than 9 months. About 6 months. The organizers are going to be mad if I get the date wrong, the timeline wrong, because they put in years worth of work into that struggle. And I think what's interesting is to also step back into the period that put us in the position where we had to reinstate affirmative action, and remembering the 90s and how horribly and explicitly racist California still was, trying to pass things like Prop 187, and I believe it was Prop 208 to ban bilingual education, and doing away with affirmative action. And one of the things that happened in that moment is that a whole slew of really dedicated, young, committed folks became politically aware and engaged. Who was it? I think it was it Saul Alinsky who said, like, the job of an organizer is to be a social arsonist, to go out and set people, aflame and to get them alive. And so I think about that period, and I think about so many incredible people who I met who were young college students and who were taking on Prop 187 and who were really putting their bodies on the line. And then I thought about, there we were trying to pick up that cause now in 2020, after so much has transpired in between those times. Now, Latino students alone are the majority of our students in our K-12 system. If you add in African Americans, they nearly push up on 2 out of 3 students in the great state of California. It's tremendous. We no longer are that minority. We are the future. And so I'm not gonna lie, it was disheartening to see Prop 16 go down. It was sad to see Prop 22 go through, which kind of further tried to gigify, I guess you will, our economy. And it just reminded me that we still have our work cut out. Sadly, people don't see the strength of community and the power of caring for one another. And so I feel like we have more to do in terms of just lifting the level of consciousness among our communities, to really think about how we can use our democratic tools. We can be engaged non-violently, most importantly, and we can use those democratic tools to rectify these horrible systems that at one time did oppress us and continue to oppress us. So for me, I've just always been really passionate and interested in politics and how that affects policy, and how together with the right timing of a strong, committed group of individuals, you could tip the balance and tip the balance in the favor of justice and equity. So I felt very, very proud to be a part of that moment at EdTrust West, working with all of our partners, people like Campaign for College Opportunity and MALDEF and Equal Justice Society. It was really a tremendous effort, and I really hope that when the time is right, we come back together and we think about how to get this across the finish line, and think about the next strategy that's going to win that battle.
Absolutely. Thank you. I mean, I think that's part of, I'm glad you brought up Prop 187. I think that for many of my generation, I'm a few years older than you, it was really a reality check to really understand policy, really understand the power of voting, really understand, really question what is that structure. Because I think we saw massive walkouts to be able to say we're not tolerating this, protests in terms of anti-immigrant, anti-Spanish speaking, anti-every that we are against our communities. And so I think we see the waves, and I think that's really the beauty of history, is that we see the waves, and then we pick up the best practices, the philosophy, the foundation of what keeps these waves moving, and how we can orchestrate ourselves and organize ourselves to push it a little bit further. And so I think even the spirit of how do we reorganize ourselves to be able to push something like Prop 16 a little bit further the next time go around. Mm-hmm. I think for one is to remind ourselves that it's not that we are the future, but that we are the present, right? Mm-hmm. It's like we're here. It's like folks like your grandfather reminded us that we would get to this point right now. And so in honoring him, it's really, really thinking about how can we be strategic enough to be able to say we have to be in these conversations, we have to be in these spaces. But then how also do we not intimidate folks to perpetuate a deficit of, sort of this divisiveness, right? It's like that. How do we start talking about how we have far more in common than we do differences as communities, specifically. And so I that's a question that I want to ask you in terms of, and thinking about the messages that your grandfather did remind us, thinking about the work that you yourself have experienced in advocating for systems change. How can we get to that level or build upon some of the leaps we've made through the years to be able to remind ourselves of the commonalities we have as communities?
Yeah. Well, I do want to just share one final thought on the Prop 16 matter. I already know that there's a lot of folks who are involved in that campaign who have already moved forward and have thought now, okay, if we're not going to win that big policy battle, then how can we implement um, new structures or our new strategies within the given situation we still have to deal with, but still continue to drive towards that ultimate goal that affirmative action tries to address on the largest level. So, I know they're working on that issue, and we'll get back around to trying to address and take care of affirmative action. So I tip my hat to all of those folks still working on those issues very creatively. When I think I lost my point. I'm sorry. Remind me again the question. My apologies. I'm
more
so
so
sorry.
about, I guess, the reality that we're experiencing right now with,
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, so I think what's really important is, again, going from that or starting point of kind of knowing your own history to really know yourself. And the more you know yourself, the less afraid you are to know the other, and to really deeply know the other, and to understand their uniqueness at a very specific level. And hopefully through looking at those specific examples, you can start to draw out those common traits of your shared humanity. I think what's really important, especially in being in community, and I'm not doing the best job of it today, but it's about the 2 ears and 1 mouth rule. You try to listen twice as much as you speak, especially when you're in a new community, and you're really trying to encounter the other, and find that shared humanity that we're talking about, to be able to respect somebody, to kind of like literally re-see them anew and a whole. I think is so important. Yesterday I was listening to a panel webinar of committed activists in the Bay Area, and it was in honor of the farm workers movement, and they were talking about solidarity. And I think somebody put it very beautifully. I think it was Connie One from AAPI Women Lead, and she was talking about how can we get to this place of transformational solidarity, and away from this idea of transactional solidarity. And I thought that was, a really great way to express it. Because yeah, I think it is so important to begin at that very basic level of our humanity, and then from there to build upon that, and then to start organizing around these common goals. So I took that very seriously, and I still take it very seriously when I go out and I meet others, and try to build that community, and identify where we may have common goals, and how we can align, as we move forward. So I think right now, what I've been seeing in the past year, and seeing how folks have been trying to show up for various communities from late last summer, with everything that arose out of the tragic George Floyd incident, to now more recently, people really starting to pay attention to this really tragic year that the AAPI community has been enduring because of the COVID pandemic and our ridiculous 46th president. I think I'm really hopeful that folks are really starting to think about what does solidarity truly look like. And I really want to try to continue to lean into identifying, those opportunities of genuine solidarity in our communities. And when I think about just the issues, kind of maybe going a level up, I also want to think about what are the adjacent issues that we could also lean into. I don't think there's any one big grand issue, but there's so many important issues. And, again, we should start with the thing that we care about most, that we're most interested in. But I think we should also try to look for those adjacent issues that are connected. So I don't know, in education, maybe it's starting to look at, zoning and planning, and how that affects, the tax base, and the resources that end up in our schools, or what have you. But I think looking for those adjacent issues, and also building that solidarity in those spaces, I think is also greatly important, as well as building that basic solidarity of our shared identities, if you will.
Absolutely. I think part of the conversation that La Comadre Network and I were having prior to setting this plática with you is feeling overwhelmed, right? Obviously, with so much going on in this 1 year that we've been in quarantine, but then having the time to really delve into a deep reflection in terms of,
Mhm.
you're saying, what is that authentic solidarity? What is that transformational solidarity? Like, and I love that in terms of the versus the transactional. But I think what we're finding as well, and I think it goes hand in hand with us having this plática and honoring your grandfather, is it goes back to the root cause of really knowing our history as a community and really knowing the resilience and the contributions that we've made to this country. And it's not, it goes beyond your grandfather, but it's really about having folks that we could rely and go to and say, let's talk about how they did it. Let's talk about how, and you share with me like what informed your grandfather to really speak to these real deep systemic levels of disrespect to our community, but in a very nonviolent way, to really be grounded in his humanity, to say, I have something to say, and I have to find a different method to really share and make that statement. So I just wanted us to really hone into that, and then maybe you could share with us a little bit of maybe some conversations you had or you've heard in your family in terms of what really influenced him to ground himself in nonviolence and really
Mhm.
humbled ways to really speak to bigger issues of oppression.
Yeah. I think some of the stories that I've heard and that I've come to understand is that I think his deep commitment to nonviolence um, comes really from the relationship I would say he had with his mother. Um, and I think that's kind of an interesting thing because they also do talk about Gandhi and his deep sense of nonviolence coming from his relationship with his mother, who was a Jain, and so understanding the role that those powerful women played in shaping those children that they were raising, who would go on to change the world. Um, I think my grandmother used to, tell my grandfather kind of like turn the other cheek. I've heard stories about at the times when they were migrant workers and they had practically just beans and tortillas at their little campsite, when they're sleeping under their car and on dirt patches. If they ever saw hobos, their mom or them, if they saw hobos in the distance, they would invite them over to have at least a little bean taco if they had nothing else. And I feel like those lessons that they learned were just imbued in him very deeply. And so as he moved forward and then began to take on these oppressive structures in society and to organize people, his staunch and firm commitment to nonviolence came from the realization that they weren't maybe having the greatest of success in those immediate locales. They were working in some pretty backward counties, Kern County, for example, and the way that they were being treated by the sheriff, who was arbitrarily enforcing the law and mostly against them when they were kind of the victims of the oppressors. He realized that they had to expand the realm of that struggle. And so when they moved on to other things like a boycott, he drew those lessons from Gandhi. He saw the example more recently of the Montgomery bus boycott and what they were able to do there. And he thought, well, let's apply this to farm workers and their economic exploitation. And so he took it to what he called the court of last resort, the American consumer, the public conscious.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that he reminded his followers, who were being afflicted with all these abuses, is that I know the pain, I know the anger, the frustration, and knowing all of that, I understand that your reaction sometimes is to clench your ball into your hand into the ball of a fist.
Mm-hmm.
He says, but that's not how we ought to respond here. We need to continue to be nonviolent, because the second that any violence besmirches this movement, we 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 start to take away from showing the rest of the world how truly oppressive, these powers that be are, and how much that's afflicting our lives. And I think, that's kind of the basis of why he was so firmly committed to nonviolence. And that's quite a lot to ask for, especially at a time when people like MLK was assassinated, when the Kennedy brothers were assassinated, when 5 other martyrs were killed for standing on the picket line. The first of whom of the 5 farm worker martyrs was actually a young Yemeni man named Naji Daifullah. Again, just kind of acknowledging, remembering that history, that it's always been immigrants who have come to America and who have done the hardest work for the least pay and probably the most dangerous conditions. So when I go out, and share with my students, especially the younger ones who are impressionable, I remind them it's not about attacking immigrants. It's about attacking the ignorance, and where that stems from, that ignorance and that fear that allows us to so easily hate the other and to keep them down.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I think part of this current situation is, the reality is being able to speak directly to issues of power, which is absolutely this ignorance. And it's also about how a lot of what we've been experiencing as communities of color, as immigrants, as low-income folk, not accessing healthcare and so forth. It's a root cause of really understanding. Let's be comfortable talking about white supremacy. Let's be comfortable talking about how these systems have been created so that the ignorance continues. And so I think part of the reason I asked about nonviolence movements, because I specifically remember, and I attribute this again to your grandfather, is understanding the power of boycotts, understanding the power that we ourselves as consumers do have power. But I was a 13-year-old kid or 14-year-old, something along those lines, living in Indio, in Coachella Valley, and knowing very well that we're not supposed to buy grapes. Like, uvas, no, like we're boycotting uvas, because, again, we had a leader. Chavez was telling us the repercussions of how it was impacting our communities. And so I think that's part of understanding how we can certainly take advantage of conversations to be able to speak directly to issues of power, systems of power, and then being able to emulate, this issue of, how can boycotting actually have a great ripple effect. And so I think even now, being able to showcase and tell my daughters about, we did that back in, the 90s, and we spoke about uvas no and what boycotts mean, and then how now we're boycotting certain entities like, Home Depot, and why that is the case. And so I think being able to have a natural conversation with our children, with our folks, to be able to say, this is why. This is the
picture. Completely. Yeah. It's funny. I'll come out and I'll admit that a lot of the presentation that I make from kindergarten to college age is very similar. And I don't try to change the language too much. I guess it's, interesting to get really intellectual about things, but I try to keep it pretty basic and plain, and as if you would explain it to a 5-year-old. And it's pretty incredible the questions that come from the young people that I get a chance to engage with and talk about these issues and work through some of these ideas. And they understand the dynamics of power very, very readily, and they could see when things are unfair. And sometimes it's really important to give yourself that test of, can I explain this issue to a 5-year-old? Because their attention is so razor sharp that the second you're disingenuous or that they can tell that you probably fibbing, they immediately start to tune you out. And so it's kind of a real treat and a gift to talk with young people who are understanding the world and all of those dynamics in their own small ways, but to also think about how it applies to the world beyond them, and for them to start seeing that. And yeah, you're right, not being afraid to talk about power. I think we're really afraid to talk about power. I feel very fortunate that we weren't afraid to talk about ideas of power growing up. And most importantly, the message that we carried forward was really the only purpose of power is to empower others. And so that's how I try to think about, well, what can I do with the little bit of power that I have, empower others. My foot gets in the door because of the little bit of power I have. The other foot's trying to kick the door off the hinges to get everybody else in behind me. It's kind of always been my attitude. So I just kind of think about that and the really great conversations that I've had with young people, and then sending those young people home with those big why questions to their parents is just as important. This past week, I was talking to people in the aerospace industry for one of their ERG groups, and I was talking to a big satellite dish TV network in one of their ERG groups, and we started talking about the idea of power in the workplace and equal pay and, some of these things. And it was kind of exciting to hear people start talking about, well, yeah, we do have these equal pay laws that are being passed in our states. Our company did set a priority to try to compensate everybody more accordingly so we wouldn't have these discrepancies. And then immediately there in the chat box and breakout rooms, you hear about people starting to set up practice sessions so that they could go in and have those conversations with their manager to learn how to advocate for themselves and for others at the job site. And I was kind of touched by that gesture. It's not maybe the typical setting that I'm used to engaging in, but I felt like in maybe our own little small way there, we were kind of carrying on that spirit that Dolores Huerta infects us all with to make sure that we never waste an opportunity to organize.
It goes back to intentionality. That's something I'm always speaking about, is like make every one of our present moments, minutes, be very intentional, and be very transformational, if you may. It's really about making sure we take advantage of the opportunities, especially when we feel we may be vulnerable. And part of it, going back to what you mentioned, we're not often encouraged to speak about power or think about power, because oftentimes we are relegated to talk about oppression and how we're oppressed. But then it's the why is it that we're oppressed that really allows us to really dig deeper. And even some of the conversations you're having with these young kids, we're having amongst community, older folk, 30, 40, 50, 80-year-olds, who are really trying to reflect and say, oh, you're right. I hadn't thought about it that way. Right? I hadn't really thought about it that way. But we have a few minutes left. I know, I don't know, Cindy, if we have any questions or comments on Facebook that we might want to consider just chiming in now. But I'm keeping my eye on the chat box. And if we don't, again, I want to take a few minutes if you want to be able to just give us a few words to close up the session and really just, and I'll wrap it up this again.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your comments around intentionality. I really, like the words that you're using, and especially this idea of encourage. It goes back to what we're just talking about, using your power to empower others. I think what's also really beautiful when you get into kind of root words and things like that, you see that the word courage and its root, cor, it really is like corazón. It comes from the heart. And it's so important to do things with really heartfulness. And I just feel lucky that, I could say I got my big heart from my mom. And I feel like that feeds so much of who I am as a person. And so, I just think, what it means to encourage others. It's a really beautiful thing. And sometimes I don't think we always take the time to fully appreciate it when we're using it, but it's something I like to geek out on. For me, I think about the incredible things that people who came before me were able to accomplish with so little. And I try not to let that ride me, because, people did some pretty incredible stuff with not a whole lot. And so sometimes it feels like, am I doing enough? And I try to not let it ride me. I try to let it inspire me. But when I look at that, and I see everything that people with so much less than I were able to do, I try to understand from their stories and their examples, how I can also continue to make my own change in my own way through my own life course. And one of the things that I really appreciated about my tata is just how much of a avid learner he was, and really continued to be throughout his life. Even though he never made it past the 8th grade, he has an incredible library that you can still see, which is pretty much intact the way he left it when he passed away. And as a first generation college student, with I think a lot of interest, when I look at his bookshelf, sometimes I wonder, will I ever be able to read, half of the topics that he was able to cover while raising a family of 8 and, running around trying to start the social justice movement. And so I like to remind my students that I get a chance to share with, but really everyone, what my tata used to say when he would say, the end of all education should surely be service to others. And I remind students that, our education doesn't just happen within, the confines of our typical school day, our work day. It's really about how we avail ourselves to the moments that pass through our life, and how we keep our eyes and our ears and our heart open, and allow for those lessons that grab hold of us, to really take hold of us and take us where we need to go. We spend so much of our life kind of like trying to grab everything else and understand it, kind of overstand it. But sometimes if we can do our best to stay in the moment and listen to ourselves and be completely honest, we'll find these moments where things really grab hold of us, and could really set us aflame, could put wind in our sails and take us very far. So that's always a message that I like to leave with when I'm done finished and sharing, that the end of all education should surely be service to others. So I want to thank you all for organizing, for bringing us together, for doing all the good work that you guys do through the La Comadre network. When I think about the farm workers movement, really women were the backbone of that movement in so many respects. We always tease and say as like a family joke that actually Helen Chavez was the first person to be organized into the farm workers movement, because if my tata couldn't convince her to give up his comfortable paying job that brought them benefits and vacations and a nice decent house, chances are there might not have ever been anything like the farm workers movement that we know. So I always think about her, and I think about Dolores, and I think about so many other incredible women and figures who were at the heart of that movement. So again, I'm just really happy to be here with the La Comadre network. It feels like I'm at home.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for reminding us of your grandfather's legacy, which is always speak con el corazón en la mano, just be authentic to your commitment to the vision that we are here and committed to our community. So thank you for taking the time. Thank you for sharing with us and being comfortable to even calling your grandfather tata. That's so dearing to me for you to hear you say that. So thank you again for joining us today, and we will certainly revisit a possibility of bring you back and just continue the conversation with us as we continue this movement of being grounded with our community. So thank you again.
And thank you, Dr. Rivas. Thank you.
Gracias.
Take care. Bye-bye.